Hello, everyone. This is our week 1 lecture. So the title of this lecture is Planning Your Course, a Decision Guide. And this comes from Appendix A in your textbook. So are we really starting at the end of the textbook? And the answer to that is yes. I think there is some good information in here to get us thinking about the material we're going to be exploring through the entire term. So I have been teaching since around 2006, 2007. At that time, I was an adjunct faculty member and I was assisting only in a lab portion of a class. So I did not have really any role in the development of the course curriculum, the creation of any course learning materials, or creation of any of the assessments. Over time, I transitioned from a adjunct faculty position to an instructor status, and then later got into a tenure track position. Was an assistant professor for a while, then I moved to a different university. I'm currently an associate professor in an entry-level DPT program and going to be getting my full professor status here in 2024. So why do I bring that up? Well, over a long period of time, I've had the opportunity to develop courses both for synchronous delivery within entry-level DPT and athletic training education programs, and asynchronous classes like the one you are participating in here. And the challenge always is, can you get across to the student what you want them to learn? And then if you do impart that knowledge, that experience, is the student able to integrate it? Is the student able to understand it and develop some level of competence? How do you determine that competency? You do some sort of assessment. So when teachers plan or design their courses, we're making a series of decisions aimed at creating a design which consists of a plan of activities for what the teacher and students will do in that course. This guide identifies the several decisions involved in designing a course, places these decisions in an appropriate sequence, and suggests ways to make good decisions. Now, the textbook author has developed or grouped these decisions into 3 phases: the initial phase, the intermediate phase, and the final phase. The initial phase is building strong primary components of the course. The intermediate phase is assembling the components into a dynamic, coherent whole. And the final phase is taking care of important details. So let's look at the initial phase here first, building strong primary components of the course. Now, in some cases, this might be really easy because you might be given a class to teach that is within your area of clinical expertise. You have a real good idea what it takes for an individual to be successful in that area. You know all of the background information somebody needs to know and the skills they need to be able to do. For example, my clinical practice specialty is in orthopedic and sports physical therapy, so rehabilitation of orthopedic injuries. I've been doing that for going on 24, 25 years. There's always new things I can learn. There's always new things that are occurring, such as advancements in surgery or creations of new treatment approaches. But I know really well what to do to evaluate a patient, to understand what those examination findings mean, and then to develop a treatment program based upon that. And if things aren't successful, to be able to counsel the individual as to what they could and should do next. Sometimes, though, you're given a class that you might not have experience in. For example, I am teaching cardiopulmonary therapeutics. Well, if there's anybody here in class that is a physical therapist, you know that we as physical therapists traditionally don't do cardiac rehab. Phase 2 and Phase 3 cardiac rehab is handled by exercise physiologists primarily, and there's a reason for that. Primary reason is, well, two reasons. One, they are skilled healthcare providers that know how to monitor patients during an exercise program. And two, physical therapists per hour are more expensive than exercise physiologists per hour. And so the hospitals made the decision to change many years ago. We as physical therapists still need to know some things. Maybe you're going to be in a rural area and you need to be able to progress somebody if there's no exercise physiologist in town. And we also need to understand things about the heart and pathophysiology, because you might work with patients within a skilled nursing facility, within a home health setting, within an inpatient setting. So I bring that up because sometimes it's going to be easy as you look at some of these characteristics here, and sometimes it may be hard and you need to think about things a little bit more. So if you'd like, you can read through this here. I just want to highlight a few things. The main things to highlight, because I think a few things aren't that, interesting to talk about, like number of students, place in the curriculum, etc., like that. That all kind of is like it is. You've got, for example, in a physical therapy program, basic sciences in the first year, clinical stuff in the second year, and in their third year, they're doing clinical work. Probably something similar in occupational therapy as well as other healthcare degrees. Look at student characteristics, though. Here's what's important. What's their prior knowledge, attitudes, maturity, and so on? Understanding what came before helps you to either not repeat things or to work your class at a higher level. Teacher characteristics are important. That's the knowledge of and feelings toward a subject and the students, your teaching philosophy, experience, and so on. You may be having to teach a class that you just hate to teach. How does that impact your delivery? Are you mindful of that? And so realizing that the class is important for whatever reason, what can you do to get past your dislike of that class? And then finally, the special pedagogical challenge. What is the special challenge to teaching this subject well? Well, for example, I also teach a class in pathophysiology. It can be a boring hour and a half of me talking about diseases that somebody may or may not see once every 20 years. Now, some of them are more common, but how do you make that more interesting for the student? How do you get them to become active in the learning process? And that's always the challenge. How do you get students to become active learners? Number 2, where do you want to go? What are your learning goals for the course? Ideally, what would you like students to get out of this course? And this textbook talks about these domains a lot, and we'll be exploring these a lot. Foundational knowledge, application, integration, human dimension, caring, and learning how to learn. I'd like you now, when I say to pause the recording and read through the definitions of each of those domains. Go ahead and pause the recording now. Okay, you have picked the recording back up. I assume that you have read through each of those. Again, we'll come back to those more throughout the term. Now, how will the students and you know if they get there? In other words, how will you know if the students have achieved particular goals for the course? What kinds of feedback and assessment would be appropriate? Sometimes it's just taking a test. Other times you may need to see them demonstrate practical skills. You may want to see them do some writing. You may want to see them debate a topic. In Exhibit A1, which you can find at the end of this textbook, and also where you can find it here in this PowerPoint, I'll jump to it in just a moment, is a sample worksheet of how to note appropriate kinds of feedback and assessment for different kinds of goals. So here's an example of that. You could print this out and fill it out if you so choose to for your class. Now remember, we're looking here at what kind of feedback and assessment would be appropriate for this course. Let's talk about feedback first. Feedback comparing student performance within the class. How did students do in general? How did some students do versus others? Is a student meeting a competency or demonstrating competent skills? That's feedback. Can they perform different special tests of the knee? Can they prescribe exercise for low back pain? Are you getting feedback from clinical partners? Everybody has students go out to do clinical internships. Are those students meeting the expectations of the clinical partners? Are they achieving what's considered entry-level status? How about community partners? Are individuals in the community valuing your program? Community partners could be groups that you have affiliations with that come in and provide patients within your clinic for students to practice on. They could be people that provide financial support to the program. They could be local, state, and national professional organizations. And then finally, another way of feedback is students passing the national exam. Now, for each general goal that you might specify, and here's where you can put your learning goals for the course, what information can you gather that will tell you and each student about individual progress toward that goal? About how well the whole class is learning? For which goals are paper and pencil evaluations sufficient? In other words, a test. Which need reflective writing? Which need performance assessment? What kind of feedback and assessment can you provide that will go beyond just providing a basis for the grade and will actually enhance the learning process? So, for example, a learning goal for the course could be students will be able to demonstrate performance of special tests when performing a musculoskeletal examination for the upper and lower extremities. The procedures for evaluating student learning could be both on the written exam, so they are able to identify particular tests that would be appropriate based upon cases, and also through a practical exam. Learning activities could be through lecture and lab. Resources could be textbook and any assigned articles. So that is an example of a worksheet component or a component of the worksheet for designing a course. Let's move on. How are you going to get there? So this is selecting or developing learning activities that reflect the principles of active learning. Again, active learning, very important. Try to avoid as much as possible not having the student engaged. That's a challenge. That's a challenge both for synchronous learning as well as asynchronous learning. Right now, I am talking to you, hopefully bringing in my experiences as a professor for 18 plus years is helping to bring the material to life. Now, how will students acquire the content, the necessary information, and ideas? What kinds of doing and observing experiences do the students need? Can you create rich learning experiences that allow students to pursue several learning goals simultaneously? What kinds of reflective dialogue will help them make sense of the content and connect it to their own lives? Can you develop multiple forms of such dialogue, like 1-minute papers, weekly journals, and end-of-term learning portfolios? Now, some of these things may be inappropriate for graduate school programs. Most of us are going to be teaching entry-level DPT, OTD, or other healthcare students. The textbook as we'll see, is more focused on undergrad. And so there are going to be at times assignments that may not seem appropriate for the graduate school student. And I would argue sometimes some of these assignments for the undergrad students may not have the maturity and the sophistication to understand the value of them. Anyways, let's continue on. Who and what can help? So finding resources. At the end of this appendix, you can organize the resources needed for each learning goal. What resources will the students need, and can you get to support each of the learning activities listed in Decision 4? These may be people, places, or things, including media. So, resources. Other things could be like online resources, could be guest speakers, could be taking people to outside lab situations. Okay, now let's look at the intermediate phase, assembling the components into a dynamic, coherent whole. So what are the major topics in the course? That's your next decision. Then what will the students need to do? What is the overall scheme of learning activities? So what are the major topics in the course? You're going to create a thematic structure for the course, identify the 4 to 7 major ideas, topics, or themes, place them in an appropriate sequence. If possible, make sure the ideas build on one another and result in a culminating project that integrates the ideas, topics, or themes. What will the students need to do? Identify the specific learning activities necessary for the desired kinds of learning and put them into an effective instructional strategy. An instructional strategy is a combination of specific learning activities in a particular sequence, usually laid out over a 1 to 3 week span of time. Each individual activity should build synergistically on students' past learning activities and prepare them for future activities. Examples of instructional strategies: a continual series of lectures and reading assignments interrupted once or twice by a midterm exam. That's basically the sequence of hear, read, test. How about a series of reading, reflective writing, and whole class discussion assignments? So this is a read, write, talk, or read, talk, write version. And then start with some field or lab work observations, followed by readings and whole class discussions. This sequence is a do, or look, read, and talk. Have students do assigned readings followed by mini tests done individually and in small groups, then move on to group-based application projects. This is a read, individual and group tests, and practice doing with feedback. You could also have them do a work through of a series of developmental stages lasting 4 to 6 weeks, building some knowledge and skills, work on small application projects, and then work on larger, more complex projects. This is build, know how, do. And then a contract for a grade, set up an agreement along the lines of read, text, and pass exams to get a C, add a research paper to get a B, do extended project, as well as a research paper to get an A. What is the overall scheme of learning activities? So this figure here illustrates a hierarchy of learning activities. And the arrow with the effectiveness by it illustrates mainly or really what the most effective ways of teaching or learning are. So at the bottom, absorbing. Presentations, lectures, webinars, videos, books, articles, podcasts. So if the students engage, they can learn that way. But if it's not delivered well, if it's boring, if the student doesn't feel like it's relevant, that's going to be harder to learn from. Discussing's up next. So this is now trying to talk about or write about different things. And then on this particular hierarchy here, they talk about planning, so deciding next steps in real life, and then practice and feedback, more like active learning at the top there, the top two areas. So earlier I had mentioned the kind of teaching strategy used a lot. This is the castle top diagram where you do some lecture, give out of class activities like reading, then do a test, then maybe there's more lecture, maybe there's problem solving homework outside of class, and then in class problem solving, and then review and an exam. So that's kind of a classic looking approach to teaching. Here is a different way of kind of thinking about these with the major topics in each course, lining them up. What are you going to be doing in class and out of class? And then doing that over a 1 to 3 week block of time. So maybe, if you're doing a musculoskeletal examination class, maybe this is just 1 to 3 weeks of teaching the shoulder and how to evaluate it and treat it. Course designs and plans provide for both differentiation and integration of learning. Differentiation can be reflected by variety in the type of learning activities from day to day within each topical block of time and in development of the complexity and challenge of the learning from topical unit 1 through 4. Integration should be reflected both within each topical unit of time and in the progression through each of the topical units. This exhibit in your appendix is another tool you could potentially use to kind of track what you want to teach. Again, these are ways of thinking about, that first time you're creating a class or taking over a class, what you want to do each session and what you want the students to do between classes. So, for example, class session here could be talking about shoulder pathology, and then maybe between classes, you're having them read a case on a particular shoulder diagnosis. And then the class session next, you're doing lab work and working on the musculoskeletal examination and discussing that particular case. And then maybe you give another case to read between classes and they come back and again try to do a lab scenario role playing that brings to life that case that they read about. Developing the design or plan for the course is very important. It is also important, though, to remember that it is only a plan. Like all plans, it needs to be flexible and subject to change as it is implemented. The final phase is taking care of important details. So, how are you going to grade? Grading should reflect the full range of learning goals and activities. Remember, you do not have to grade everything, but make sure you do grade some instances of every kind of learning you want students to retain. What does that mean? Well, you could give class participation grades. Those are very nebulous, like what is that? Doesn't mean you have to grade every class participation session, but kind of give a general grade. I'd say most of the time we try not to give students excess learning activities that they aren't being graded upon. We want to have some sort of meaning or value to them. The relative weight of each item in the grade course or in the course grade should reflect the relative importance of that activity. What could go wrong? Debug the design by analyzing and assessing this first draft of your course. Is it based on an in-depth analysis of the situational factors? Does it include higher level learning goals? The feedback and assessment activities reflect the principles of educative assessment. Do the teaching and learning activities include active learning? Are the four components well integrated? Possible mechanical problems. Will the students have the time to do their out-of-class assignments? Will they be able to obtain the necessary resources? For instance, how many students will be trying to obtain reading material in the library reserve at the same time? Are there enough copies for all of them? Let students know what you are planning. So this is now the time to write the course syllabus. Listed here are the general components of the course syllabus. take a moment to read through this. I'll have you pause the recording. And kind of picking things back up. The reason that I put this here is students get a lot of information thrown at them. And not only is it important to have it in the course syllabus, but they need to learn how to keep track of things. And we can help facilitate that by maybe on our online learning platform, have due dates listed. That way they can visually see things. How will you know when the course is going? Or I should say, how will you know how the course is going and how it went? And you want to plan an evaluation of the course itself and of your teaching performance. What kinds of midterm and end of term feedback will you need? And what specific questions do you have about the degree to which your goals for the course were achieved, the effectiveness of particular learning activities, your ability to interact effectively with students? Well, a lot of times, seeing how they perform, I think seeing how somebody does on practical based assignments gives you an idea about their learning. I think you get feedback based upon how they do on the national exam. The national exam for PT, OT, etc. is broken down into different learning categories. So they get an idea about, okay, how they do in cardiovascular, how they do in musculoskeletal sections. So that can be informative. And also feedback from the clinical partners on how people are doing in particular areas. What sources can give you information you need to answer these questions? Those are listed there. All right, final project. The details will be delivered in week 2. In general, you're going to be creating and recording a lecture. For your homework this week, submit to me via email by Sunday midnight on a Word document the following: what your topic will be for your lecture, what you will need to perform, what you will need to perform the lecture and or lab, and what source material will you be using.